The reservation at La Fleur had been Lauren's idea, a way to mark our 5th anniversary in style. It was her favorite kind of place. Dim lighting, soft music, the faint hum of conversation mingling with the clink of silverware. Normally, I would have been looking forward to it, savoring her excitement. But tonight wasn't about celebration. Tonight was about truth. Lauren descended the stairs in a sleek red gown that hugged her figure perfectly. Her hair was pinned back elegantly, her lips painted a deep crimson. She looked stunning, the way she always did for special occasions. I forced a smile, feeling the familiar pang of affection mix with something colder. "You look beautiful," I said evenly, holding out her coat. She smiled, a flicker of warmth in her expression. "Thank you. You clean up well yourself." The drive to the restaurant was filled with light chatter, Lauren recounting stories about work, stories that seemed designed to steer my attention elsewhere. She had a way of filling silences with just the right amount of casual conversation, but my mind wasn't on her words. It was on everything I'd learned in the past few months. It had started small. She'd begun mentioning Gregory Hart, her boss, more frequently, her tone light and familiar in a way that didn't sit right. At first, I'd chalked it up to professional admiration. But then came the late nights, the business trips, the careful way she kept her phone just out of my reach. My instincts, honed from years of covert operations, told me something wasn't right. One night, while she slept, I unlocked her phone. What I found there left no room for doubt. Texts filled with flirtation, lingering too close to the line before crossing it entirely. Messages about secret meetings, little jokes they shared, and then explicit photos. It wasn't just an affair, it was an alternate life she'd built with him. Still, I didn't react. Not outwardly. Years in my field had taught me the value of patience and strategy. I started gathering evidence, installing discreet surveillance equipment and tracking her movements. Within weeks, I had more than enough to confirm everything. What I hadn't anticipated was the truth about Oliver. My son. Or rather, Gregory Hart's son. The DNA test had been a punch to the gut, a cruel confirmation that the child I'd cherished might not be mine at all. By the time we pulled into La Fleur, I had made my peace with it, or as much peace as a man in my position could make. My plan was already in motion. Lauren's credit cards were cancelled. Her access to our joint accounts was revoked. Her belongings were packed and waiting at her mother's house. As the hostess led us to our table, Lauren looked around, her face lighting up. "You really went all out," she said, sliding into the booth. "For our anniversary?" "Of course." I smiled at her, raising my glass after the waiter poured our wine. "To us," I said smoothly, my voice betraying nothing. She smiled, her eyes sparkling. "To 5 amazing years." I took a slow sip of wine, savoring the irony. She had no idea this dinner was the beginning of the end. Lauren seemed completely at ease, sipping her wine with practiced elegance, her eyes scanning the restaurant like she belonged there. She always loved these moments, being the center of attention, dressing to impress. I'd been mesmerized by that confidence once, proud to call her my wife. Tonight, it only felt hollow. The evening had started on a deceptively pleasant note. She talked about work, about Oliver, even threw in a story about a colleague's mishap during a meeting. Her laughter rang out lightly, a sound that used to fill me with joy but now felt rehearsed. She was comfortable, unaware of the storm I'd been holding inside. As the first course arrived, I let her lead the conversation, nodding occasionally but saying little. My focus was on what was to come. The envelope in my jacket pocket felt heavier with each passing moment. It contained everything, the DNA results, the messages, and the timeline of her secret life with Gregory Hart. When the time felt right, I pulled the envelope out and slid it across the table. Lauren hesitated for a moment, her smile faltering as she picked it up. Her fingers trembled slightly as she opened it, expecting something celebratory or sentimental. Instead, her face fell, the color draining as she skimmed the contents. Her body stiffened, and she set the papers down carefully, her eyes darting toward me, searching for some hint of explanation or mercy. But I remained calm, composed. She didn't say anything right away, but her breathing grew uneven, her lips parting slightly as if trying to form words. Her usual quick wit failed her. She sat back, her hand clutching her napkin like it was the only thing anchoring her to the moment. I could see the wheels turning, searching for an angle, a way to regain control. Finally, she tried to explain, her voice cracking as she spoke about feeling lost, about mistakes made in moments of weakness. There were no real apologies, just fragmented justifications, each one more desperate than the last. She even tried to bring Oliver into it, to position him as the reason we should work through things. I didn't respond to her appeals. Instead, I placed a second envelope on the table. Divorce papers, ready for her signature. The reality of the situation began to sink in for her. She reached out to touch my hand, but I pulled away, her tears doing little to move me. By then, her emotions had shifted to anger, her voice rising slightly, accusing me of giving up too easily, of not trying to salvage what we had. It was all a performance. She didn't deny the affair, didn't even defend herself against the evidence I'd placed in front of her. Instead, she tried to turn the blame back onto me. The waiter appeared briefly, his cheerful demeanor fading as he sensed the tension at the table. I dismissed him with a polite nod, assuring him everything was fine. Lauren barely acknowledged him, too caught up in her unraveling. Her anger gave way to desperation as she begged me to reconsider, her words growing quieter, almost pleading. I let her speak, unmoved. There was nothing left to salvage, nothing to fix. The life she'd built with Gregory had destroyed the one we'd shared. As I stood to leave, I left a handful of cash on the table, more than enough to cover the meal. Lauren called my name softly, but I didn't stop. I could feel her gaze on my back as I walked out of the restaurant, the weight of everything I'd prepared for finally lifting. The night air hit me as I stepped outside. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of clarity. Lauren's cries echoed faintly behind me, but I didn't look back. There was no need. Leaving La Fleur felt surreal. The weight of the confrontation had lifted, but the void it left behind wasn't as satisfying as I'd imagined. The streets were quiet, bathed in soft lamplight, and my footsteps echoed faintly as I walked to the car. The sound of Lauren's voice, calling after me, was still fresh in my ears, but I forced myself to push it aside. This was a moment of closure, not hesitation. When I reached the car, I leaned against the door for a moment, letting the cool metal ground me. The evidence, the papers, the confrontation, it had all gone exactly as I planned, but that didn't erase the betrayal. The truth was final, unchangeable. Lauren's choices had burned everything we built to the ground. By the time I got home, her absence was palpable. The house was eerily silent, even though Oliver's toys were scattered across the living room floor, untouched since this morning. I picked up a stuffed bear and stared at it for a moment. My chest tightened. Oliver was innocent in all this, and yet he was a living reminder of the lies Lauren had woven into our lives. I poured myself a drink, letting the whiskey burn as it went down. The plan was in motion. Lauren had nowhere to go but to the reality I'd set up for her. Her belongings were already boxed and delivered to her mother's house. Her access to our finances was cut off, the locks to the house changed. She would find out soon enough that she no longer had any hold here. The silence didn't last long. My phone buzzed on the counter, its harsh vibration cutting through the stillness. Her name flashed across the screen. I stared at it for a moment, torn between answering and letting it go. Eventually, I picked up, but I didn't speak. Ethan, her voice was shaky, raw, a mix of anger and pleading. You didn't have to humiliate me like that. I let her words hang in the air, the silence between us speaking louder than anything I could say. She continued, her tone growing sharper. You don't get to just end things like this. We've been through too much. Don't you think Oliver deserves better than this? The mention of Oliver made my grip on the phone tighten. Don't bring him into this, I said finally, my voice cold and steady. You made your choices, Lauren. Now you live with them. She started to say something else, but I hung up. There was no point in dragging it out. The next few days unfolded exactly as I'd expected. Gregory Hart, the man she had risked everything for, was about to face the fallout of his own. By exposing his illicit dealings, financial misconduct buried deep in his firm's records, I ensured his career was about to crumble. It didn't take long for the firm's board to discover the evidence I anonymously provided. Lauren's lover, her perfect man, was suddenly without the power and prestige that had drawn her to him in the first place. It wasn't long before Gregory's fury turned outward. When Lauren didn't return his calls, likely too humiliated to face him, he showed up at my doorstep, his face a mask of barely restrained rage. But this was my domain, my fortress. He didn't know what he was walking into. Gregory Hart arrived late in the evening, his car screeching to a halt outside my house. I'd been expecting him ever since I leaked the evidence of his dirty dealings to his firm. People like Gregory didn't take losing well, and now he had lost his position, his reputation, and whatever fantasy he had built with Lauren. Through the living room window, I watched him storm toward the front door, his movements hurried and clumsy, fueled by desperation and anger. I didn't move to greet him. Let him come to me. The pounding on the door shook the frame. "Ethan," he shouted, his voice strained and uneven. "Open the damn door." I didn't answer right away. Instead, I finished my drink, placed the glass down neatly, and approached the door with deliberate slowness. I unlocked it, opening it just wide enough to meet his eyes. He was red-faced, his tie loosened, and his shirt rumpled. A far cry from the polished lawyer Lauren had chosen. "Gregory," I said coolly, leaning casually against the doorframe. "To what do I owe this pleasure?" "You know why I'm here," he spat, stepping closer. "You think you can just ruin my career, my life, and get away with it?" I didn't respond immediately, letting his words hang in the charged air. His fists clenched at his sides, his body practically vibrating with anger. "Ruin your life?" I said finally, my voice calm, almost amused. "You ruined it yourself. You had plenty of chances to make better choices, Gregory. This is just the natural outcome." He stepped forward, and I didn't stop him, letting him cross the threshold. His arrogance, even now, made him reckless. "You've got no idea who you're dealing with," he growled, his voice low and threatening. I raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "I think I have a pretty good idea. And for the record, this isn't the first time I've dealt with someone like you." Gregory's bravado faltered for a moment, but his anger quickly reasserted itself. He tried to push past me, but that was his mistake. My home wasn't just a house. It was fortified, a product of my years in covert operations. He tripped the automated security system the moment he crossed the entryway. Before he could take another step, there was a sharp hiss followed by the soft thud of a dart striking his shoulder. His movements slowed almost immediately, confusion clouding his expression as the tranquilizer took effect. What did you?" he slurred, staggering backward, his legs giving out beneath him. I knelt beside him as he crumpled to the floor, his breath ragged, his eyes darting wildly. "You really should have thought this through," I said quietly. "But then, thinking doesn't seem to be your strong suit." Moments later, the sound of tires on gravel signaled the arrival of my associates. They moved quickly, efficiently, carrying Gregory out of the house and into the waiting vehicle. He was conscious enough to protest weakly, but his words were incoherent, his body limp. As the car disappeared down the road, I closed the door, the house falling silent once more. My agency would handle Gregory now, ensuring that whatever secrets he still held would be uncovered. By the time they were done, his career, and any lingering influence he thought he had, would be nothing but a memory. I stood in the quiet of my living room, the adrenaline finally ebbing away. Gregory was out of my life, but the damage he and Lauren had done remained. I glanced at the clock. It was late, but I knew sleep wouldn't come easily. For the first time in weeks, though, I felt something close to relief. The pieces were falling into place, and the life I'd once known was finally behind me. Lauren's calls started early the next morning, relentless and panicked. I let them go to voicemail. By midday, the text messages began, short at first, then longer, each one dripping with desperation. "Ethan, we need to talk. Please. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. You don't understand what Gregory has done. Please call me." By evening, she was standing on the front porch. Through the peephole, I saw her pacing, her hair unkempt and her makeup streaked, a stark contrast to the poised woman I'd faced at dinner. I opened the door just enough to lean against the frame. "Lauren," I said evenly, blocking her from stepping inside. Her eyes searched mine, wide and pleading. "Ethan, you have to listen to me," she said quickly, her words tumbling out in a rush. "Gregory. He's not who I thought he was. He's dangerous. He's losing everything, and now he's blaming me." I stayed silent, letting her scramble to fill the void. She reached for my arm, her grip weak, almost trembling. "Please, I know I made mistakes, Terrible ones, but we can fix this, she said, her voice breaking. I was stupid, blind. I didn't see what I had until it was too late. You didn't see? I repeated, my tone sharp. Lauren, you had everything in front of you, and you chose to throw it away. Don't stand here pretending you're the victim now. Her face crumpled at my words, her hands clutching at her sides as though trying to hold herself together. I was wrong, she whispered. I see that now. I'll do anything, Ethan. Anything. Just don't let this be the end of us. I studied her for a long moment. This was a woman who once commanded every room she walked into, who thrived on control and confidence. Now, she was unraveling. It should have felt satisfying, but all I felt was emptiness. Us, I said finally, my voice cold. There is no us, Lauren. Not anymore. Her eyes brimmed with tears, her voice rising in desperation. What about Oliver? What about our family? We can still make it work for him. At the mention of Oliver, my expression hardened. Don't bring him into this. You've already done enough damage. I didn't mean to hurt him, she sobbed, covering her face with her hands. Her words hit a nerve, but I forced myself to stay composed. It's too late for that, I said. And for you. You made your bed, Lauren. Now you get to lie in it. For a moment, she looked like she might argue, but the fight in her was gone. She nodded faintly, her tears falling silently as she backed away from the door. I'm sorry, she murmured, more to herself than to me, before turning and walking to her car. I watched her go, the engine stalling once before roaring to life. The headlights disappeared down the street, leaving the night quiet again. Inside, I sat on the edge of the couch, staring at the photos on the mantel. Lauren was gone from my life, but the fallout was far from over. The days that followed felt strangely hollow. The storm had passed, but the wreckage it left behind was all too real. Lauren was gone, though her messages still came intermittently. Pleas for understanding, apologies that rang hollow, attempts to evoke the family we once were. I didn't reply. Oliver, however, was a different matter. He was innocent in all this. For all the pain his existence represented now, I couldn't turn my back on him. I'd raised him, cared for him, and those bonds didn't dissolve with a DNA test. The thought of him growing up in the shadow of Lauren's choices made me sick. Whatever happened next, I'd ensure he had stability. The agency had been quiet during all this. That was the nature of my work. No contact until there was something they needed. So, when my phone buzzed late one night with a message from Director Atlas, I wasn't surprised. We need to meet. Same place as before. 2,100 hours. The message was brief, the location clear. A nondescript safe house on the edge of town that doubled as a private briefing location. I arrived just before the hour, the streets silent under the cover of night. Atlas was already there, sitting at the metal table in the dimly lit room. He was an imposing figure, graying but still sharp, his presence commanding without effort. You've been busy, he said without preamble, gesturing for me to sit. I didn't respond immediately, lowering myself into the chair across from him. He slid a folder across the table, its contents partially visible. A profile, photographs, operational notes. You handled the heart situation with precision, Atlas continued, his tone unreadable. Efficient. Clean. But now it's time to refocus. We have a new mission, and you're the only one with the skills to pull it off. I opened the folder, skimming the details. It was high level, the kind of operation that demanded more than just technical expertise. It required complete detachment, an ability to act without hesitation or doubt. Atlas leaned back, his eyes narrowing as he studied me. You're good at compartmentalizing, Ethan, but this is a whole new level. If your personal situation is going to be a distraction, tell me now. His words were blunt, cutting straight to the point. I looked up, meeting his gaze. It's not, I said firmly. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then, Atlas nodded, satisfied. Good. Because this mission, it's darker than anything you've dealt with before. And if you succeed, there's no going back. He didn't need to elaborate. I understood what he meant. This was the kind of operation that rewrote the rules, that blurred the lines between right and wrong. But after everything Lauren had done, after the betrayal and the destruction of the life I thought I had, Those lines had already been erased. Atlas stood, his chair scraping softly against the floor. I'll give you time to review the file. You'll receive the full briefing tomorrow. He paused at the door, glancing back at me. You did good, Ethan, he said, his voice quieter now. Sometimes cleaning up the personal mess makes you sharper for the bigger challenges. As the door closed behind him, I leaned back in the chair, the folder still in my hands. The mission inside represented a new beginning, a chance to channel everything I'd been through into something that mattered. For better or worse, my old life was over. It was time to step into the shadows once more. The next morning brought a strange kind of calm. The mission folder sat on my kitchen counter, its stark lettering a reminder of what lay ahead. But my thoughts weren't on the operation. They were on Oliver. Despite everything, he was still my son in every way that mattered. I'd been there for his first steps, his first words, his scraped knees and bedtime stories. The bond we shared didn't vanish because of Lauren's lies. I'd raised him, loved him, and I still did. When Lauren dropped him off that afternoon for our scheduled handoff, her appearance startled me. She looked disheveled, her usually flawless exterior cracked. For the first time in years, she seemed vulnerable, almost human. She lingered on the porch after Oliver ran inside, as if searching for the right words. I didn't know if you'd still want to see him, she said finally, her voice barely audible. I stared at her, anger flaring briefly before I smothered it. He's my son, I said, my tone clipped. Her eyes filled with tears, but I turned away before she could respond, focusing instead on Oliver's laughter echoing from the living room. Inside, Oliver was sitting on the floor surrounded by his favorite action figures. His face lit up when he saw me. Daddy, look. I made them into a team. I crouched down beside him, smiling despite the ache in my chest. Looks like a strong team, buddy. Who's their leader? He picked up a figure, a soldier with a determined expression and a cape draped over one shoulder. This guy, he said proudly, because he never lets anything bad happen to the others. The weight of his words hit harder than I expected. I ruffled his hair, forcing a smile. That's a good choice. Every team needs a leader like that. As the afternoon wore on, I found myself caught between two worlds. On one hand, the mission demanded my focus, a chance to bury myself in something that mattered beyond my personal pain. On the other, there was Oliver. Innocent, trusting, and looking at me as if I were his entire world. When bedtime came, Oliver crawled into my lap with a book, his small hands gripping the edges tightly. He listened intently as I read, his head resting against my chest. By the time I finished, his breathing had slowed, his tiny body heavy with sleep. Carrying him to his bed, I felt a pang of guilt. The mission would pull me away, possibly for weeks. How could I reconcile the man I needed to be for Oliver with the man my work required me to become? I stood in his doorway for a long time after tucking him in, the faint glow of his nightlight illuminating his peaceful face. The world I was stepping into again was harsh, unforgiving. It demanded sacrifices. But for Oliver, I would do whatever it took to protect what little innocence he had left. Even if it meant keeping parts of my life hidden from him forever. The days leading up to the mission were a blur of preparation. I threw myself into the details, studying the folder Director Atlas had given me until I could recite every name, location, and connection in my sleep. The target was a network of operatives smuggling arms into politically unstable regions. Dangerous, elusive, and well-funded. Taking them down required precision, cunning, and absolute focus. But focus didn't come as easily as it used to. Oliver had a way of pulling me out of the shadows, his laughter echoing through the house as he played, his small voice asking 100 questions about things only a child could find fascinating. It was grounding, even comforting, but it also felt like a reminder of how fragile this balance was. One evening, as I packed a go-bag with essentials, maps, forged documents, concealed weapons, Oliver wandered into the room. "Daddy, what's that?" he asked, pointing to the black duffel bag on the bed. "Just some work stuff," I said casually, zipping it shut and setting it on the floor. His brow furrowed in that serious way he had when he was trying to figure something out. "Are you going on a trip?" "Maybe," I replied, kneeling to his level. "But I'll be back soon. And Grandma will take good care of you while I'm gone." "Can I come with you?" he asked, his tone hopeful. I smiled, ruffling his hair. "Not this time, buddy. It's boring grown-up stuff. You'd fall asleep. He pouted but nodded, clearly not satisfied with my answer. Okay. But you have to call me, okay? So I can tell you what Mr. Bear does when you're gone. I promise, I said, pulling him into a hug. His small arms wrapped tightly around my neck, and for a moment, the weight of what I was about to do felt unbearable. Later that night, after Oliver was asleep, I sat on the edge of my bed staring at the go-bag. The house was quiet, but my mind wasn't. Each mission demanded a piece of me, a part that would never come back. This one felt heavier, not just because of its stakes but because of what I was leaving behind. The next day, I called Lauren's mother. Despite everything, she had always been good to Oliver, and I trusted her to keep him safe. She agreed to take him for as long as I needed, her voice warm and understanding. "You're a good father, Ethan," she said softly before we ended the call. "He's lucky to have you." The words stuck with me, even as I drove Oliver to her house that evening. He chatted the entire way, oblivious to the storm inside me. When we arrived, he hugged me tightly, his face buried against my chest. "Don't be gone too long, okay?" he said, his voice muffled. "I won't," I promised, even though I knew it was a promise I might not be able to keep. As I drove away, the weight of the mission settled firmly on my shoulders. The next phase of my life had begun, one step deeper into the shadows, one step further from the normalcy I'd once believed was mine. But if this mission brought even a fraction of the stability Oliver deserved, it would be worth it. The mission started quietly, as these things often did. It was always the calm before the storm, the meticulous setup, the waiting. The first objective was infiltration, becoming someone else, someone the targets would trust just enough to let their guard down. I arrived in Prague under the alias Eric Kane, a seasoned logistics coordinator with connections to the kind of people who made things move in silence. My cover had been crafted perfectly, with forged documents and a backstory that could withstand scrutiny. The agency made sure I had everything I needed to blend in. The target was a man named Pavel Kovar, a mid-level operator in the smuggling ring. He wasn't the mastermind, but he was the gatekeeper, the one who vetted new players. Getting to him meant getting into the heart of the network. For 2 days, I shadowed him, memorizing his routines. He was careful, methodical, and rarely deviated from his habits. Each morning, he visited a small cafe near the Charles Bridge, where he'd sit alone by the window with a cup of espresso and a cigarette. On the third morning, I made my move. I sat at the table beside his, a casual but intentional placement. I kept my demeanor neutral, just another businessman enjoying the view. When the waitress brought my coffee, I made a subtle gesture toward Pavel's cigarette case. "Do you mind?" I asked, nodding at it. He glanced at me, his eyes sharp but not immediately hostile. After a moment, he slid the case across the table. "Help yourself," he said, his Czech accent thick but clear. I lit the cigarette with a nod of thanks, taking a slow drag before speaking. "I hear you're the man to talk to if someone wants to make things happen around here." He didn't react immediately, his expression unreadable as he studied me. "Depends on what you're looking for," he said finally, his tone guarded. "Shipping logistics," I replied, leaning back in my chair. "No questions asked." His eyes narrowed slightly, but I saw the flicker of interest. "That's a bold thing to say to someone you've just met." I shrugged, keeping my movements relaxed. Sometimes bold is the only way to get what you need. The conversation unfolded in careful increments, each word a test, each response a calculation. By the time Pavel finished his espresso, I had a tentative meeting arranged, a chance to prove my worth to his associates. That night, I returned to the rented flat the agency had secured for me. It was sparse but functional, stocked with everything I needed to prepare for the next phase. I sat at the small table, reviewing the details I'd gathered on Pavel's network, mapping out connections and potential vulnerabilities. My phone buzzed, a secure message from Director Atlas. "Progress." I typed back a brief reply. "In position. First contact made." His response came almost instantly. "Good. Stay sharp. This group doesn't forgive mistakes." I stared at the screen for a moment before setting the phone down. The truth was, mistakes weren't an option. Not here, not with these people. One wrong move could unravel everything. As the hours ticked by, I thought of Oliver. I pictured him sitting at his grandmother's table, chattering away about school or his favorite cartoons. I wondered if he missed me yet, if he'd asked why I hadn't called. But this was the life I'd chosen. The shadows didn't allow room for second thoughts or regrets. The next morning, I stepped out into the crisp Prague air, ready to meet Pavel and his associates. The mission was in motion now, and there was no turning back. The meeting with Pavel's associates took place in a dimly lit wine cellar beneath a small bistro, a classic front for clandestine dealings. The room smelled of damp stone and aged wine, and Pavel sat at a central table flanked by two men, their expressions unreadable. Pavel introduced me briefly, his tone clipped, but it was clear this was a test. One of the men, a tall, broad figure with a faint scar on his jaw, scrutinized me. "If you're here, it means you think you belong. Prove it." Pavel cut in before I could answer, laying out the terms. There was a shipment of high-value cargo scheduled for the next night, military-grade weapons hidden among industrial supplies. My task was to ensure it moved without interference. No questions. No mistakes. The next evening, I arrived at the storage yard near the Vltava River. The place was dimly lit, the kind of location that didn't ask for attention. Pavel and a small crew were already there, overseeing the loading of crates onto an unmarked truck. The operation was smooth, efficient, but the air was tense. I stayed alert, scanning the shadows and noting every detail. The rhythm of the operation shifted when headlights appeared at the far end of the yard. A car rolled up, stopping just short of the truck. The tension was immediate. This wasn't part of the plan. The driver stepped out, a man in a police uniform, though the casual way he moved suggested he wasn't entirely legitimate. He greeted us with a smirk and an air of false confidence. "You've got an interesting shipment here," he said, his tone light but probing. Pavel tensed beside me, his hand inching toward his jacket, but I stepped forward first. "We're on a tight schedule," I said calmly, meeting the officer's gaze. "What do you want?" The officer took his time, circling the truck and inspecting the crates. "I could look the other way," he said finally. "But I need something in return." It was a shakedown, plain and simple. I turned to Pavel, who nodded subtly. We both knew violence here would only complicate things. Reaching into my jacket, I pulled out a slim envelope filled with cash and handed it over. The officer grinned, flipping through the money before pocketing it. "Pleasure doing business," he said, retreating to his car. Once the car disappeared, Pavel glanced at me, his expression guarded. "You handled that well," he said simply. The truck rolled out minutes later, the cargo secured, and I knew I'd passed their first test. But this wasn't just about proving myself, it was about positioning. Every move I made was another step closer to dismantling their operation from within. That night, I reported back to Atlas. The mission was progressing, but there was no room for error. Pavel and his crew were watching me closely, and the deeper I got, the more dangerous it became. This was the life I had chosen, living in the shadows, every step calculated, every move a risk. But I didn't do it for myself. I did it for Oliver, to ensure he'd grow up in a world where men like Pavel and the ones above him wouldn't thrive. For now, I was part of their world. But they wouldn't see me coming when I brought it crashing down. As the days passed, I became a fixture in Pavel's operation. The men no longer watched me with suspicion, but I could sense they weren't fully at ease. Trust came slowly in their world, and I knew that one misstep would turn their wary acceptance into hostility. My next task came quickly. Pavel introduced me to a man named Victor, a sharp-eyed logistics handler who was responsible for coordinating the movement of shipments across borders. "Victor will show you the ropes," Pavel said curtly. "Don't slow him down." Victor wasn't the kind to make small talk. He was precise and efficient, barking instructions as we moved crates and reviewed manifests. The shipments varied: firearms, sensitive electronics, even chemicals that didn't belong in civilian hands. Each item was marked for destinations that revealed the operation scale: Central Europe, the Middle East, Africa. During these days, I observed everything: key players, communication methods, weak points in their supply chain. I noted how Pavel rarely dealt with the shipments directly, preferring to let men like Victor and others handle the details. It was clear Pavel was just one piece of a much larger puzzle, a middleman with limited influence. That insight came into sharper focus one night during a delivery. We were meeting a client, a tall, well-dressed man whose demeanor screamed wealth and authority. He wasn't one of Pavel's usual contacts. Victor deferred to him, lowering his voice and watching his tone. The man introduced himself as Mikhail Volkov, though I doubted that was his real name. He barely acknowledged me, his attention focused on Victor and the cargo. He inspected the shipment with practiced efficiency, then handed over an envelope far thicker than the one I'd used to bribe the officer at the storage yard. "Everything is in order," Mikhail said, his tone clipped, before turning to leave. I didn't need to know much more to understand who Mikhail was. He wasn't just a client, he was part of the upper echelon, someone who operated above men like Pavel. If this mission was going to succeed, I'd need to get closer to him. That night, I reported my findings to Director Atlas via secure channels. The inclusion of someone like Mikhail confirmed the operation's global scale. Atlas's response was as expected. Focus on gaining his trust. Volkov is the key to dismantling the network. The next week was a blur of activity. Pavel began assigning me to more sensitive tasks, testing my discretion and reliability. I handled everything without hesitation, ensuring I appeared indispensable. Slowly, Pavel's demeanor shifted. He started including me in conversations I wasn't privy to before, dropping hints about larger operations. The breakthrough came when Pavel called me to a private meeting in the same wine cellar where we'd first spoken. "You've proven yourself, Eric," he said, lighting a cigarette and leaning back in his chair. "There's an upcoming job, biggest one yet. Volkov personally requested that you be involved." My pulse quickened, though I kept my expression neutral. "What's the job?" Pavel exhaled a cloud of smoke, his eyes narrowing. "You'll find out soon enough. For now, just know it's important. And dangerous." Dangerous wasn't new to me. But this felt different. It wasn't just about surviving, it was about navigating a world where every move was watched, every word scrutinized. As I left the meeting, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being drawn deeper into something far darker than even I had anticipated. The stakes were rising, and with each step closer to Volkov, the risks grew. But this was the mission, and there was no turning back. 3 days later, I met Volkov at an abandoned train depot on the outskirts of Prague. The location was carefully chosen, isolated and quiet, with rusted freight cars and shadows thick enough to hide anything. Pavel introduced me to Volkov, the man I already knew to be a critical link in the operation. Volkov barely glanced at me, his focus on the cargo Pavel had prepared. His bodyguards worked efficiently, prying open crates to inspect the weapons. Their approval came with a curt nod, and Volkov turned to Pavel, discussing the payment. When the deal was done, Volkov finally addressed me. His dark eyes studied me, his words deliberate. "This is the new man?" Pavel nodded. "Eric's reliable." Volkov didn't smile, but his tone shifted slightly. "Reliability is rare. Let's hope it's deserved." I held his gaze and replied evenly, "It is." Volkov watched me for a beat longer, then nodded and left. As his car disappeared, Pavel muttered under his breath, "If he spoke to you, he's watching. Don't screw it up." The next step came quickly. Volkov requested me for a larger operation, a weapons transfer on a private airstrip. This was a higher-stakes job, involving international movement and doctored manifests. The airstrip was buzzing with activity when I arrived. Pavel handled logistics, but Volkov was in command. His attention to detail was surgical, every crate checked, every movement precise. I stayed close, observing and making myself useful without overstepping. As the last crates were loaded onto the plane, Volkov approached me. His voice was calm, but his words carried weight. "You've proven capable so far. There's more work for those who can be trusted." "Whatever you need," I replied, keeping my tone professional. Volkov nodded but didn't elaborate. The operation concluded without a hitch, and as I left the airstrip, I knew I was in. That night, I reported to Atlas. Volkov's network was vast but carefully structured, with layers of protection and trusted operatives. Breaking it would require precision, but I was getting closer. The trust one was earning would soon become their downfall. The time to strike was drawing near, and when I moved, I'd make sure Volkov's empire crumbled from within. The fallout was swift and precise. The intelligence extracted from Volkov's briefcase exposed the inner workings of his network, allowing Atlas's team to target key operations. In Istanbul, law enforcement intercepted a major shipment, dealing a significant financial blow. Across Europe, arrests mounted, and flagged accounts froze the flow of illicit funds. Volkov's network was unraveling, and the strain showed. Pavel, once methodical, grew paranoid, accusing his own men of betrayal. Volkov responded with cold efficiency, tightening his circle and severing ties with anyone he suspected of weakness. Despite the chaos, Volkov continued to rely on me. The deeper I embedded myself, the more vulnerable his operation became. During a high-stakes meeting in Vienna, Volkov addressed his inner circle with the confidence of a man refusing to admit defeat. "We've been compromised," he said, pacing before them. "But we will recover. Weakness has been dealt with." Afterward, he turned to me. "You've proven reliable," he said, his voice measured. "Now I need you to stay closer. If there's a traitor, find them." The irony wasn't lost on me. Volkov trusted me to eliminate a threat I had orchestrated. His network was crumbling, and each move he made brought him closer to its final collapse. The endgame began at an abandoned airstrip, Volkov's chosen site for a last-ditch escape. With law enforcement closing in and his network in tatters, he planned to flee under the cover of a hastily arranged deal. My role was to ensure he showed up and stayed long enough for the authorities to move in. The airstrip was quiet when I arrived, the early evening light casting long shadows across the tarmac. Volkov's car pulled up minutes later, its sleek black exterior betraying nothing of the chaos he left in his wake. Pavel stepped out first, followed by two guards, their hands resting near concealed holsters. Volkov exited last, his face calm but his movements sharp with tension. He approached me, his gaze piercing. "Is everything ready?" "The plane's fueled, and the route is clear," I replied, keeping my tone steady. Volkov nodded, but his eyes lingered on me for a moment longer, as if searching for something unspoken. "Good," he said finally. "This has been an unfortunate chapter. But it's not the end." As he turned toward the plane, the faint sound of sirens broke through the stillness. Flashing lights appeared on the horizon, growing brighter as vehicles sped toward the airstrip. Volkov froze, his composure cracking for the first time. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice low and dangerous. Pavel reached for his weapon, but I moved faster, pulling mine and aiming it squarely at Volkov. "Don't," I said, my voice calm but firm. Volkov's expression shifted from shock to fury as realization dawned. "It was you," he hissed. The sirens grew louder, and law enforcement vehicles surrounded the airstrip. Volkov's guards dropped their weapons under the weight of the overwhelming response. Officers moved in quickly, securing the scene and placing Volkov in handcuffs. As they led him away, he turned back to glare at me, his voice cold. "You think this is over?" I met his gaze without flinching. "For you, it is." The operation was complete. Volkov's empire, built on fear and corruption, was dismantled piece by piece. Back at the safe house, Atlas reviewed the mission with a rare nod of approval. "Flawless execution," he said. "The fallout will resonate for years." But I didn't linger. My thoughts were already on home, on Oliver. The weight of the mission began to fade as I drove back, the shadows receding with every mile. When I walked through the door, Oliver ran to me, his laughter breaking through the quiet. I scooped him up, holding him tightly. In that moment, I knew. The fight was worth it. The end came swiftly. Volkov, once untouchable, was cornered at a private airstrip under the pretense of a final deal. With his network crumbling, he intended to flee to a safe haven, but every step of his plan played directly into ours. My role was clear. Keep him there long enough for law enforcement to close in. The airstrip was eerily quiet when I arrived, its dim lights casting long shadows across the tarmac. Volkov's car pulled up moments later, its sleek black form betraying none of the desperation within. Pavel exited first, his movements tense, followed by two armed men. Volkov emerged last, his coat billowing slightly in the cold breeze, his expression a mask of calm control. He approached me directly, his dark eyes sharp. "Everything is in place?" "The plane's fueled and the route is clear," I replied, matching his calm tone. He nodded, though his gaze lingered. "Good. This operation may be finished, but the world is full of opportunities for men like us." I said nothing, merely returning his gaze. Volkov turned toward the plane, but before he could board, the distant wail of sirens shattered the stillness. Red and blue lights cut through the dark, growing closer with every second. Volkov froze, his composure cracking for the first time. "What is this?" he demanded, spinning to face Pavel. Before Pavel could act, I drew my weapon, leveling it at him and Volkov. "It's over," I said, my voice steady. Pavel hesitated, his hand halfway to his holster, but the sight of law enforcement vehicles surrounding the airstrip made him freeze. Volkov's glare turned to me, his voice low and venomous. "You betrayed me." The air seemed to hold its breath as officers swarmed in, disarming Volkov's men and taking them into custody. Volkov didn't resist, though his cold gaze never left mine as they secured his wrists in handcuffs. "This isn't the end," he said quietly, his tone filled with venom. "For you it is," I replied. As the vehicles disappeared into the distance, taking Volkov and his men with them, the weight of the mission began to lift. Back at the safe house, Atlas debriefed me in his usual clipped manner. "The operation is a success. Volkov's empire is done, and the ripple effects will reshape the underworld for years." I nodded but said little. My thoughts were already elsewhere. When I returned home, Oliver ran into my arms, his laughter filling the quiet house. I held him close, the warmth of his small body a reminder of why I'd stepped into the shadows in the first place. For now, the world was quiet, and I was exactly where I needed to be.